Notes from the Future presentation by Becca, Hallie, Jamie, and Cameron. So Brown versus Board of Education started in December of 52 and is going to last 2 years. It'll conclude in May of 54. So y'all are in a time right now where this court case is going to end segregation in schools, right? Well, kind of. Unfortunately, we can tell you from 2023 that Brown versus Board didn't do as much good as it could have. And we're going to give you some insights on what to avoid and what you can do better to make a more successful outcome from this case. So the whole premise of Brown versus Board is to give African American children better schooling opportunities compared to what they were receiving. And ending school segregation is a great place to start, isn't it? It is. However, it was not done in the best of ways. Well, first of all, it was also a political move. So America was getting a lot of heat for the ongoing racism problems we were facing. And what better way than to pass some laws that are going to end school segregation? Well, they didn't really put as much work into the implementation part as they did the big showboating of public schools are desegregated. They were focusing on how can we minimize the problem and not how can we actually successfully end segregation and racism. So what all went wrong? Well, there's a few things. African American teachers were not typically given jobs at integrated schools. Usually they were dismissed as teachers or they were demoted at their new schools. So African American children no longer had adults to look up to in a school building, which is a big no-no. Decisions on how to end segregation were left up to the school districts. So they had a say of when they could do things and how they can do things and make choices. And that led for a lot of discontinuity between districts and states overall. So government should set expectations and dates that all public schools need to follow during the transition from closing down these African American only schools and merging those students with the public schools that were originally white only. There's no timeline or dates given, so that should all be a part of that too. Citizens did not understand how harmful that segregation and racism were to their society. So while it was great that these schools were becoming desegregated, society, the communities, they were still very segregated, and they weren't really working on bridging those gaps. So that is something that should also be done. It's giving opportunities for members of society to come together and be one and be diverse and celebrate. Low-income African American families also did not receive additional support from the government or funding, so they were still missing out on opportunities like extracurriculars, tutoring, and early childhood programs. So funding should be given to all low-income families, no matter what their ethnicity is. That is something that is huge. And why is it huge? Well, because there was a bit of a gap between what African American students knew academically and what white students knew. Just coming from two different backgrounds of educational experiences and opportunities, there was a bit of a gap. So African American students were typically behind, and they did not receive extra support, so they continued to be behind. One way to fix this is to have smaller class sizes. Hire those African American teachers and mix the classes and shrink the sizes to bridge the gap and have everyone on the same playing field as best as you can. And then another issue is that neighborhoods were still very segregated. Realtors could still deny housing to families based on skin color. If they wanted to have a white neighborhood, they could choose pretty much who they would sell to, and that made property values higher versus living in a African American community. And so there should be guidelines too for realtors and property owners on what you can and can't do. And so I am going to send this over to Jamie, who's going to continue kind of explaining some things that were going on.
Thanks, Becca. Unfortunately, Becca's right. Things didn't turn out quite as hoped for the Brown supporters. The disappointment started right away in the 50s and continued through the 60s and still plagues our educational system today in 2023. The times of the 50s and 60s were a great time for the American economy. The housing market made it so that it was cheaper to buy a new house in the suburb than it was to rent an apartment. Unfortunately, upon returning from war, white GIs were given different stimulus checks than the black GIs. These wonderful housing developments that started, where people were being given great loans and opportunities to buy, were only available to white families. These new suburbs, filled with their white families, built new schools and filled them with their white children. The black families were left out of the American dream. Generational wealth started during this time due to the ability to buy and own a home and have great property taxes and later increase your value by buying a better home. Black families were not allowed to participate in that sort of wealth development. During this time, the economic gap and the educational gap that Becca mentioned earlier just kept increasing, furthering the distance between the privileged and the disadvantaged. We need to take advantage of the successful economy to really fund these families and their neighborhoods so that all Americans can participate in the American dream. So what should have been done? Housing grants and mortgage loans for every American. Multiracial neighborhoods should be given lower property taxes. And within these neighborhood systems, the Parks and Recs Department can receive increased funding for supporting these neighborhood relationships. Still, it's not all doom and gloom. After all, the Brown versus Board decision did lead to other great strides. The Civil Rights Act was enacted in 1964, and later gender equality was introduced to education through the Title IX Act in 1972. Most Americans were excited about these changes and excited for the rights that their fellow Black Americans would have with them. Unfortunately, this time is plagued by a new term that stuck with the United States for quite a few decades: colorblindness. Through this, white Americans were able to live through society successfully as if race didn't matter. But unfortunately, during this time, Black Americans were stuck in living in an existing system where the scaffolding was already set and it still didn't allow them access to the top. Let's talk about education, what went wrong, and then shine the light on how we can improve things for everybody. Some schools in the South were unable to integrate due to their location and transportation of students. The major problem, as Becca stated, was that teachers were not offered equal jobs. Most Black teachers simply lost their jobs, and white teachers took over the teaching responsibilities. What should have been done instead? Integrate Black teachers into the new integrated schools. Reward successfully integrated schools with increased government funding, and give media attention to those schools so that families can see that integration works. Government-funded teams can be put in place to oversee the school districts, to actually step foot into the schools, to oversee the curriculum, the mixed races of all of the students and the teachers, and to really ensure that the American dream is being implemented and lived out in these children's daily lives. Increased and properly distributed school funding ensures that properly educated teachers can support their students, and also that there are excess funds for family events. Schools are where children come to be educated and where families can come to grow bonds with each other and receive support and shared resources. We need to show these families that integration matters and everybody's lives are improved when you have it. One problem with privilege is that if you have it, you don't realize it. This is a time when you can shine a light on the privileged and the disadvantaged and bridge that gap between the two. There are no studies that show that white children are harmed by integration, but there are several studies that show that Black children are harmed by segregation. This is a time that integration needs to be championed because everybody benefits from a society where all of its members are recognized and respected. Let it be known that you support integrated neighborhoods and schools and do not stand silent when you see segregation slipping back in. We're now going to move on to Cameron, who's going to tell us more.
Desegregation and the emerging resegregation 1970s to 1990s. Widespread implementation of desegregation in the 1970s and 1980s. The Supreme Court rulings and civil rights legislation passed by Congress in the 1960s set the stage for desegregation in schools in the 1970s. Although Brown v. Board of Education ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional in 1954, many school districts resisted ending segregation until more pressure from the federal government and executive branch was applied. The 1964 Civil Rights Act included federal measures to enforce school districts implement desegregation, including withholding federal funding from schools that refused to dismantle segregation. Subsequent congressional action and a series of Supreme Court rulings in the late 1960s and early 1970s compelled public schools districts to integrate. In 1969, the Supreme Court ruled in Alexander v. Holmes County Board of Education that all schools across the nation fully desegregate by February of 1970. In 1970, President Nixon declared Brown to be a right in both constitutional and human terms, and formed a commission to work with local and state leaders to persuade them to understand and accept the wisdom and humanity behind the law. In 1971, the Supreme Court decision, Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, ruled that the federal courts could use busing as further integration tool to achieve a racial balance. Many districts voluntarily or involuntarily implemented freedom of choice plans, which gave families the choice to enroll their student in schools that were previously all black or all white. In some cases, courts ordered attendance boundaries to be redrawn or school attendance to be reorganized by grade level rather than by geography. While there was initially resistance to racial segregation, it diminished in public schools, reaching its lowest point in 1988. But the resistance persisted and trends in desegregation began to reverse. White population found ways to avoid forced integration of public schools by moving from urban areas to suburban areas that were predominantly wealthier and more white. White families also avoided integration by withdrawing their children from their local public schools and enrolling them into newly founded segregation academies. Despite court decisions and aggressive federal measures, many school districts never fully desegregated. By the 1980s, the dominant political narrative to label integration as a failure. President Reagan called on Congress to outlaw the use of busing. In 1982, the Reagan administration reversed a Nixon-era policy which would grant tax exemptions to racially discriminatory schools. By the early 1990s, busing was disappearing across the United States, although a handful of school districts remained under such court orders. Public schools have been steadily becoming more racially segregated since 1988. Core challenges ended interdistrict desegregation plans and allowed the return of neighborhood schools. The 1991 Supreme Court case, Board of Education v. Dowell, ruled that it is not unconstitutional to end federal school desegregation order if it had succeeded in eliminating past discrimination and it had been followed in good faith. Racial discrimination in housing, including redlining, municipal zoning codes, and local state laws that dictate how public assistance funds can be used have created more segregated communities and reinforced segregation in schools.
Thank you, Cameron. Most people would think that after years and years of trying for equality, that there would be no more segregation as we enter the 21st century. School population was far more diverse, and there were no all-white schools anymore. Diversity comes so far, but we can still see segregation in school and outside of schools. Segregation in the 21st century involves the removal and isolation of poor Black and Latino students. 1 in every 3 Black students attend a school that acts as though Brown versus Board never even happened. Now, how can this be possible? Well, most of this starts with the housing in the 21st century. Housing has become the locus of segregation despite the Fair Housing Act. Racial minorities still encounter discrimination when it comes to rent, buy, finance, or insure on a home. These minorities also tend to have far more unlawful encounters of discrimination with a real estate or rental agents. So by the early 2000s, there was an increasing evidence of urban change. Non-white families were moving into suburbs, which then led to the white flight. These inner ring suburbs were replaced with the outer ring as wealthy continued to move farther and farther away. Poverty began to migrate into these suburbs, and by the middle to late 2000s, there was more poverty than there had ever been before in those suburbs. So although the 21st century is from a diverse and a multiracial society, metropolitan regions remain deeply segregated, and this type of segregation is more complex than ever. Due to segregation of housing, there continues to be segregation in the schools. The Department of Education has created tracking, which students are separated on educational paths based on their academic performances as a teen or younger. So this tracking system keeps many students of color from long-term equal achievement. If you were to actually walk into one of these classrooms, you would be able to tell if it was the upper level class or the lower level class based on the racial composition of the classroom. So due to this act of segregation, racial students were taken away the opportunity of higher level courses in education. And with the two graphs that I provided here, it shows the AP class enrollment and kind of like an upper level math class in comparison to white and black students. Okay, so what all went wrong? There was isolation of black and Latinos compared to whites. There was discrimination of housing that led to poverty in the suburbs. Students were racially segregated based on their previous academic performances. So what should have been done? There shouldn't have been any discrimination in the schools. There should have been a continuum of the Fair Housing Act. There should have been exception for minorities to move into white majority suburbs. There should have been no tracking system created in the first place, and equal opportunity for higher level education should have been provided for all students. My group mates and I have provided information on what went wrong following the decision of Brown versus Board of Education and what should have been done in order for these implementations to have not happened. When we all work together as one, there's a strong possibility for greatness. It is possible for our society to have equality for all when we are not compliant with the status quo. Let's encourage those in power to speak up for those who need their voices to be heard. We need to work together as a country instead of working against each other. Greatness is in the future, and it's possible for our society to get there all together.